Hello and welcome to the second video in a group of 5 videos on middle pair. And my name's Ben Hayles. This is brought to you by Postfloppoker.com. Today I'm going to be talking about equity and board texture. You can see the group of 5 videos there. I'm going to dive straight in and talk to you about how I feel when a flop comes down. Generally, when a flop comes down, I want to arm myself with a few questions that are going to help drive smart decision making. This is the most important part of any poker hand. As the flop comes down, reassessing your strength, your equity. To do that, I'm going to want to think about my range. I'm going to think about my opponent's range. I'm going to think about my own hand's equity against my opponent's range, and also I'm going to want to think about my hand range's equity against my opponent's hand range. So how do we achieve all that? Well, simple questions. What's his range? If you're not asking that, you will be going wrong. You need to know your opponent's range. It's really, really important. I know it's a thankless task. It's really hard, and you will get it wrong frequently. We all do. Don't give up. Estimating your opponent's range is essential. It'll really improve you as a poker player, and if you just get into the habit of always doing it, you will definitely get better. Not only do you need to know his range, you need to think about how his range has hit the board, so you can work out what the relative strength of his entire range is. If you struggle with this, just visualizing it, use a tool like Flopzilla or just a simple equity calculator, and that will help you to visualize what is a difficult thing. Now, instead of thinking just about your hand strength, you know you've got middle pair. You flop middle pair equity against his range. It's probably going to be around 50%. It may be a bit more, it may be a bit less. But think about your entire range. How did you arrive in this situation? What's your range? Because this is the information available to your opponent, and you need to be aware of what he's thinking. To do that, you need to think range against range. So what's my own range? What's my entire range? It's the same process that you go through for analysing his range, but you do it for your own. And then think about how your range hits the board. These steps 3 and 4, if you're missing them, then that's okay. You're still possibly playing really, really good poker, making really smart decisions, but you're missing the sort of additional step in the depth of the thought processes, and you may also miss out on some potentially really interesting lines that you can take representing hands that you don't have later in the hand. So it opens up more possibilities if you're not narrowing in just on the hand that you're holding, but you're thinking about all the hands that you could hold. Step 5 is just a continuation of these steps. So the actual equity calculation. How does my range perform, and how does it perform against his range? Yeah, that gives you your equity range against range. Finally, you want to think about how well your actual hand is doing, and you can kind of compare step 5 and 6. So it may well be that your range has 40% equity against your opponent, and it may well be that your hand has 50% equity. So your hand is usually, because you flop something slightly better than average, it's usually going to be ahead of your range, but not always. So it's important to do both of that in your mind mentally. If you can do that, you are thinking at a really, really high level. Okay, so let's talk a bit about equity. Normally with middle pair, your hand is going to have somewhere between 30 and 70% equity against one opponent. In multi-way pots, that's going to differ quite substantially. But against a single opponent, you're going to have somewhere between these margins, usually going to be a bit above 50%. But there are times when your opponent's range is much narrower, when your equity is going to be a bit lower, especially in like a 3-bet pot where your opponent has narrowed his range down to some pretty strong hands. So in certain spots, you're going to have a really, really wide range. Maybe you're playing heads up, small blind against big blind, for example, and your opponent's range is wide open. So middle pair's a lot stronger in that situation. But when your opponent's playing a really narrow range, middle pair becomes a little bit, it's a bit trickier to play because your opponent is much more likely to go deeper into the hand, make it much more difficult for you to win either a small pot or a big pot. Your range will usually have slightly less equity. I made that point before, that your hand's going to have probably above 50% equity, not always, but your range, that will depend on the situation, how you got to where you are. If you're the raiser in position, then yeah, you're probably going to be slightly behind someone calling. If you've been 3-bet, you're going to be behind if you've called. So usually the range war is determined by how you arrived at the post-flop situation, which I'm going to talk more about in the next video. Generally speaking, with middle pair, you're going to have enough equity to justify continuing in the pot at the flop stage. So especially if you've got position, you're not so worried if your equity is a bit below 50%. You still feel like you've got the right odds to continue, and you can use your position perhaps to win more chips and possibly to knock your opponent off a hand. However, if you find yourself in a spot where you think your equity is less than 40%, then you should probably be a little bit less willing to even continue in the hand, you know. It depends a lot on how much your opponent bets and how you arrived in that situation. But generally speaking, equity below 40%, not too keen on throwing too many chips into the pot. I make the point here that, you know, if you are arriving here with middle pair and your equity's really low, then there's a possibility you may be misplaying pre-flop. So you should have a look at that. Think about maybe, well, should have folded to the 3-bet. The final point at the bottom there, just be aware that if you've got 3 cards of the same suit on a flop, you flop middle pair, if you're not holding a flush draw, then your equity will be inevitably lower. It's fairly obvious, you'll feel that whilst you're playing, but it makes quite a big difference to your equity in the hand. What I would like to do now is to look at some equity calculations together with you. I'm not going to do a whole load, but I want to take you through the process so it highlights what I've just been saying. Okay, I'm going to show you 2 rather extreme examples of varied equity holding middle pair. The first one, imagine you raise from the hijack with 10-9 suited. You're 3-bet by the big blind, and I've entered in natural ranges for these actions, and then the flop comes down. So first of all, before the flop comes down, your equity looks like this. If you call the 3-bet, you're at the bottom of your range calling with 9-10 suited, but it's a rational play. So you've got about 39% equity. It's not great, but you think it's worth having a look because you're trying to hit a flush or a straight or a really good draw so that you can make a massive pot. That's where the benefit comes from with this type of hand. What you're not trying to do is flop middle pair against a three better, because middle pair against a three better could be in quite big trouble. So you don't want to be playing a massive pot with middle pair, but you do want to be playing a massive pot if you're holding a really good flush draw, straight draw, or you've even flopped a flush or a straight. So it's gone wrong when you flop middle pair with this type of situation. So it's difficult to know how to proceed, but your equity is not going to be good. Let's say the flop comes down ace 9-4, really, really dry. And for your hand, that's just not a good flop. Your opponent's range, now if we look at the range against range war, you've dropped 10%. Can you see that on the right hand side? His equity has now gone up to 70%, and that's just the range against range war. If we change our hand to 10-9 suited, and I'll give us clubs, which gives us a backdoor flush draw, this is what happens to the equity. It actually goes down, and it goes down to a horrific 20%. So when I say on the previous slide that you are likely to have 30 to 70% equity, this is an extreme example where that drops to a ridiculous 20% equity. You don't want to be continuing in this type of spot. Okay, now look at my second example where I'm going to use a small blind, big blind situation. Let's say the small blind raises out of position with a natural sort of 70-odd% range, which I've got plugged in here. And the big blind calls pre-flop with a massive range, which just doesn't include some of the biggest hands, quite a few hands with aces in. And that's the reason why the equity is slightly behind. The big blind's going to be slightly behind the small blinds in terms of range against range equity. And that's just because the big blind would have 3-bet with some of those monster hands. But essentially with really, really wide ranges, you're going to have similar equity. And that's just always the case. In fact, even when I plug in a flop, because both of the ranges have so many hands in, it doesn't matter what flop I put in. It's not going to affect the range too much. Probably because the small blind's got more equity, they're going to prefer the really big cards like an ace. But generally, it doesn't matter too much. So you'll see when I plug in a flop that the equity just isn't going to change too much. As you can see, there's a couple of high cards, Jack 10, which may connect slightly better with the small blinds range. So you can see a slight increase there. But generally speaking, there's just not going to be a lot of difference whatever flop you bring down. So let's see if the range against range isn't really changing much. Let's have a look at what happens when we give ourselves middle pair. So let's say we're holding Queen 10 offsuit. And now just look at what happens to the equity now. So you can see against a wide range in the small blind, middle pair has much, much, much more equity. So it's a lot stronger, and you should be far more willing to proceed aggressively in the hand. And that's the main point that I want to make, is that against narrow ranges, your equity is going to be smaller, and against really wide ranges, your equity is going to be really good. But generally, your equity is going to be between 30 and 70% most of the time. And I have picked two of the more extreme examples to try and highlight this discrepancy in how much equity you're going to have with middle pair. Okay, I'd like to finish up this video by making a couple of basic points on board texture and then one more advanced bit of thinking. So, middle pair has more equity on dry boards. That's fairly obvious. Your opponent is going to have fewer reasons to build a big pot, and you want a smaller pot. You're going to take these down a lot more often at the flop stage. There's going to be a nice small pot for you. That's ideal. That's what you're looking for. You're not looking for complications and big pots when you're playing middle pair. It's harder to play on wet boards, especially if your opponent is going to be able to represent with his range. He's going to be able to represent flushes and straights later in the hand. If you're the guy whose range is more likely to be able to represent flushes and straights, then the wet board may give you some possibilities. I'm assuming, of course, that you haven't got a draw. If you do have a draw, then your entire situation is different. Your equity is much higher, and there's a whole bunch of more aggressive lines you'll be able to take. But in general, you're not going to be holding a draw. You've used up one of your cards making middle pair, so you've only got one other floating around, and that makes it much more hard to have a decent draw. And probably if you do have a decent draw, it won't be very disguised because you're only using one of your cards, whereas your opponent has two cards active for drawing. Okay, just bringing up the rest of the information on the slide. Consider whose ranges hit the board better. We've made this point already a few times. I'm drilling it home. And when we looked at the equity calculations, we looked at range against range, not just at hand against range. Why are we doing that? Well, we're doing it because of the possibilities it generates in the future of the hand. We may be able to represent a different hand. Don't close your eyes to this possibility. How difficult will it be to play on the turn and river? Really good question to ask yourself at the flop stage, because sometimes you'll use this question to discard your hand, just throw it away, decide this is not a good spot. You're out of position, your middle pair is quite a small pair, like a 5, lots of bad cards are going to come on turn and river, not going to be easy to play, your opponent's aggressive. This type of spot, yeah, it's usually best to just give up. But the reverse can also be true. You may find that your range is the one that connects better with possible flush and straight draws available, and that there's a whole bunch of cards that you're going to be willing to represent on the turn or the river in order to throw your opponent off a hand, especially if you get in a situation where you believe your opponent is holding top pair, for example, and you're really confident that he's holding top pair. You've just got middle pair, but your range is really good for representing a flush or a straight, and so you may be able to take a really aggressive bluffing or semi-bluffing line, which enables you to win. You'll need a deep stack situation to pull this off. Usually middle pair is not an ideal hand to go bluffing with later and representing a different hand, but it's something that you should always keep in mind as a possibility. You'll need to know your opponent. You'll need to know how likely it is that you'll be able to make him fold. It's advanced play, but it's worth trying out, and if you find a good spot, go for it. That concludes this second video on middle pair, equity and board texture. My name's Ben Hayles. Thank you for listening.